Hello, everybody. Aaron Lelito here with another Lit Mag profile. And for today, I have Amy Dupcak, who is a poetry editor for Cagibi Literary Magazine.
I'm actually
So,
not the poetry editor.
oh, who are you? Who am I
I'm
talking to?
I'm the editor-in-chief.
Editor-in-chief.
Yes.
Even better. So yeah, excuse my mistake there. So yeah, I think I'll pass it to Amy before I make any more mistakes up front. Amy, can you give a little bit about your background as a writer, as an editor, and a little bit about maybe your connection point with how you got involved with Kajibi?
Sure. And where to begin? So I guess I've always been a writer. When I was a kid, I like to talk to myself and just like make up stories. So those didn't all make it onto paper, but I was always telling stories. And then I guess I got into poetry in like middle school and thought I was a great poet, of course, as you do when you're 12. And yeah, I like wrote this poetry manuscript and sent it out to an adult contest that I lost, of course, but they were like, "You're the youngest person to submit." That's nice. And the summer of going into junior year, summer of 2000, I went to a Sarah Lawrence writing program for high school students that was on campus for a week. And it like completely changed the course of my life. It was like, oh my God, I found my people. I found like what I want to do, like where I want to go to school, like what I want to be involved in. So those were like my first real writing workshops that I took. Definitely was writing a lot of poetry then. And I also met people that ended up changing the course of my life too. So that everything sort of comes back to this one week. And then the following summer, summer before 9/11, I took a class at NYU for high school students in creative writing. And then I was like, I don't know, I want to go to NYU because it's in the city, but Sarah Lawrence, it's close to where I grew up. And I ended up applying early and going to Sarah Lawrence because that was just like the ideal place for me. And it was its own microcosm. So even though I grew up like 15 minutes away from the campus, it was not at all. Like it was like I might as well have been on a totally different environment. I also went to Catholic school. So it was a very far cry from Catholic school. And I concentrated on poetry my first 2 years there. We do these, there's this like first year studies program where, because it's an open curriculum, but you'll get a seminar that are just first years as opposed to most of the other seminars that are open to all grades and levels. So my first year studies was in poetry with Joan Larkin, and I also met with her once a week privately, and she became my Dawn at Sarah Lawrence, so like my mentor for the next few years until she left and I had to change Dawns. But that intensive poetry workshop was just incredible for me. It was the entire year long. And then the next year, I studied with two other poetry instructors or poetry professors at Sarah Lawrence. And then I decided to switch to fiction, actually, which I don't know why exactly I abandoned poetry. Like, I can't totally put my finger on it, but I think I was just like wanted to switch it up while I was there and thought, well, maybe fiction will apply to more things later than poetry because it is such a niche genre. Um, so I switched over to fiction, but with this like poetry background. So my stories tended to not be very plot heavy. They were like very imagistic and like all about the language and stuff. So it's actually kind of weirdly writing hybrid pieces, but that's when I started doing short stories. Yeah, so we didn't have majors at Sarah Lawrence, but technically, I mean, if I I was basically a writing major, but it was more like a concentration. And then I ended up applying to the new school for my MFA. I had like a gap year in between where I lived in the city, in New York City, and worked at Kim's Video and started writing for a music and culture magazine, like an indie magazine. And I was doing a lot of journalistic writing, which I also really enjoyed because I love music and I come from kind of a musical family, but I don't really play music myself. So it was like a way to engage with music using the skills that I had. But then I went for my MFA in fiction, and I think it was my senior beginning of my senior year. I like put out my first like poetry collection, which was like 100 poems. It was ridiculous, and like it gave this spiral bound copy of this giant book to like maybe 8 people or something to read. One of which was my mom, which was like not the best idea because it was like my angsty high school poetry, and she was like, "I'm sorry, I did my best." I'm like, "No, mom, this is just like it's not a critique of you." Um, but yeah, so I had a lot of encouragement early on. Obviously, that was not my best work, but I had really supportive English teachers in high school that I really bonded with. And so that book ended up sort of it was called Dust. And after college, I decided to put out another Dust, but this time it was short stories. And it was like me compiling the work I had done in college and then in grad school. And that continued to evolve until the point where I actually put together a collection and was sending it to presses and to agents that took short story collections, which are really hard to publish. So I ended up publishing that book of 14 short stories on a friend's small press to like get it out into the world after I was like sick of sending it to places and just getting rejected. And I had been sending my work out to journals, magazines, contests for years. So I was used to rejection at that point. The winding road of writers, but that's basically my writing background in terms of my own stuff. But then I've also had
Yeah.
an education, like writing education background because I knew that I wanted to teach writing workshops and creative writing classes and things. So I started doing that my last semester of grad school. Started with a creative writing class for high school seniors at my old high school, which is no longer a high school, but it's like the theme of my life. It's like um, but I designed and implemented a academic creative writing class. It had to be academic because that's the kind of school where you need to grade people, which was like a lot of angst and anxiety about grading creative work, which I don't want to ever really have to do that again. But it was a really great experience for me. And then I ended up teaching at Pace University in downtown Manhattan for 3 years as an adjunct English professor, doing, the students writing essays, teaching literature, teaching the mechanics of writing, research writing. And then I ended up starting to work for Writopia, which is a nonprofit program for kids and teens that offers writing workshops throughout the school year, weekends, holiday breaks, and summers. So I've been there for 12 years. Yeah, next year will be my 13th year. I've worked with so many teenagers and tweens and middle schoolers. And I also manage and work at the Writers Rock, which is their cousin organization that works with adult writers. So everything is words. My whole, everything I do. I guess I just really
Yeah.
love words.
Yeah, you're pretty well steeped in the literary art form, it seems. Yeah, and it's interesting, in people's formative experiences. I'm glad you shared a little bit of that going back. And it's interesting to hear that sometimes there are these kind of like supportive environments. And like you said, when you did that initial workshop at Sarah Lawrence, it kind of just clicked. It's like, yeah, this fits,
Yeah.
this feels right. Many times people they can need that little like push or acceptance or just validation or whatever that bit of encouragement is, and then it's off and running.
It was the community aspect too, like it was like the validation, but the fact that I could be amongst people who took this as seriously as I did and like, who like made writing a huge part of their lives and like part of their identity, that was like very new to me at that time.
Yeah, that's interesting too. Yeah, for myself, I kind of came to that much later, and that is one of the aspects of Wild Roof Journal that is most engaging, and that's probably what part of what keeps me going is like, oh, there's these group of people, this community of people. In our case, it's more of like, virtually, but there are real people out there who connect
Yeah.
with us via, social media and the website and all the other things. But yeah, point is like there is that environment of like, oh yeah, other people are doing this. They could be supportive of what I do. I could be supportive of what they do, and you're seeing it all the time in terms of engaging with submitting and the whole process of and creating and even going into workshops and things that are a little more hands-on.
Mhm.
Um, that's pretty cool. And then just to like touch on the poetry to fiction, either overlap or transition between the two. I found it interesting that like you said your fiction writing is not necessarily plot heavy, which sometimes I feel like I prefer at times even as a reader. I say like maybe I'm not that big on plot. And so I'm just curious
Yeah.
to like hear you like what do you mean by that
Mm.
in that sense? Is it like how would you maybe describe what aesthetically what's appealing in fiction if not plot?
Hmm. Well, I definitely have more of a sense of plot now, and I think that came out of turning my initial like novel manuscript that I wasn't even sure what it was. Like, is this a short story? Is this a novella? And then it's like, no, it's a novel. Turning that into like a YA novel, like, kind of forced me to reckon with plot a lot more than I had before that. Um, and I actually do now because I'm working with Writopia and with other students for so long. I have more of a sense of what makes a short story feel final, or what even makes it a story. So like yes, the actual like plot trajectory of that. But I think when like I'm reading for Cagibi or when I'm just reading for my own enjoyment, and also writing, I guess I just prioritize the experience over like where the story is going, if that makes sense. Like what are like right now I'm reading Greek Lessons by Han Kang. And I'm not actually sure where the story is going at all. Like but it's so beautifully written and the moments that she creates, like the small moments are so powerful and the intricacies of the texture, like the descriptions and the voice and the memories associated with the protagonist's memories and like small interactions. To me, those things are what really stick, like in my brain as a writer. Like the like where it's going or what do they want or the main obstacle is like it can definitely keep you reading if it's that kind of story, but I don't think it's as essential as voice and going deep into like a character's psyche. So like internal landscapes, external landscapes, the feeling of it, the mood, the vibe. I guess those are just things that I prioritize as a writer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. I like that you mentioned your current read. Do you have like considered favorites or writers that you just go back to and have as either influences, inspirations?
Yeah, I actually took notes on this day because I was like, like when someone asks you your favorite and then your mind just goes
Yeah,
blank
you
and you're like,
forget
no,
half of them. Yeah.
yeah, like I have an answer. I'm the kind of reader where I'm not necessarily loyal to like authors. It's like more about like the books, but I definitely also binge on specific authors. And one of them is Sigrid Nunez, because her writing is just so, she's just an eloquent writer. I just like drink up her sentences. And she writes in this style where you're like, is this true? Like, how much of this is true? How much of this is fictionalized? And she does this hybrid work where she like brings in commentary on other things. Like she'll be talking about Joan Didion's Slouching Towards Bethlehem, like in the book, and it's like, what? Or she'll be talking like very meta about writing. So I love her books. I love Miranda July. She's been a favorite of mine for a long time, and I just read all fours in like a week. And it's definitely up there in my top 10 favorite books ever. So it's always a good sign when a book you just read like makes it to the top of the list. Um, it's phenomenal and funny and weird. I've always loved short stories, so I have read a lot of short story collections. I really liked Kristen Rupenian's collection. She's the author of Cat Person. I thought that was great. I like Amy Bender's stories and Julia Oranger's stories. The Goldfinch is also one of my favorite books. So Donna Tartt, definitely up there. Sally Rooney, I have her new book that I haven't read yet. Jonathan Safran Foer, he's just incredible. Jennifer Egan, Margaret Atwood. I just also read two books by Karen Thompson Walker, The Dreamers and The Age of Miracles, that I also really loved and really enjoyed her language and like poetic sensibility. Yeah, so those are more like the prose writers, right? And
Yeah.
Nabokov, like from the time I was in 10th grade when I first read Lolita, I was like obsessed with his prose. I made like a poster and like put all my favorite sentences like in a collage on the poster. Even though it's from Lolita, which is like kind of like oh, but it's just so beautiful. Um, and then there's also the poets. My like core poetry favorites are Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath. They're like, the female confessional poets and Adrienne Rich. Yeah, I was obsessed with Anne Sexton in high school. So a lot of my early poems kind of read like hers. And I've read, all the classics or many classics, but I'm mostly into modern poets. I do have a whole list. I don't know if you want me to read.
Well, maybe we'll hear some more, but yeah, just to consider a little bit of what you said there.
Yeah.
Well, a few things that stood out was just a quick one maybe is a Nabokov. I definitely had a phase too. Even I appreciate him now as much as ever, but as far as reading some of his work, and I always like have a fun time slash challenging time like trying to describe Pal Fire to somebody who's not familiar
Yes.
with it. Because
Yeah,
it is
that
one of my favorite books, and I think it's just such a great example of like what it like what could this form be if you're as
yeah.
creative as as he is, he as he was. Do you want to take a run at it for people who might not be familiar with the novel Pal Fire? What makes
Oh
that
my God.
so
Oh my.
appealing?
I mean, it's definitely an epistolary novel, right? But it's like
Yeah.
in a form that's isn't it like index cards that he wrote to annotate the poem? Yeah. That was just
Yeah.
wild. I actually wrote an emulation of that in graduate school, so that was weird. Like
Yeah.
I used like a Nine Inch Nails song as like the lyrics of that song and then like annotated it with like but yeah, I don't really remember like how it works as a
Yeah.
novel, though, I
I
have to
know it's been
say.
a while, but yeah, I think the to oversimplify, it's the narrator of the novel
Mhm.
is the is writing a commentary on a fictional poet's poem.
Right, right.
And so what becomes the majority of the novel is this kind of this annotated section of the poem
Hmm.
written by this fictional commentator. And so it becomes it becomes the narrator's own novel
Yeah.
through the annotations of the poem. And it just becomes more and more unhinged as it goes. It's a definitely novel for book nerds in particular because it's set
Hmm.
up like a scholarly edition of a book. There's an introduction written by this fictional
Right.
character, and then the poem written by this fictional poet, and then the annotations written back by the fictional.
So many levels right there.
Yeah, and it's just one of those wormholes where like I remember reading the novel and then reading like the scholarly like journal articles, like trying to like figure out more and more. And there are these little
Yeah.
like I mean they're called Easter eggs now. I don't know what they were called back then, but there's these little like nuggets that are hidden in embedded in there that
Yeah.
you would never know. And like it just like
Yeah.
keeps revealing more and more. So it just that was one of the novels like
Wow,
how
you're
much of
making
a
me want to
genius was this
reread
guy?
it.
I know. But it just kind of goes to show you, I was like one of those writers just working on a different level than everybody else.
Mhm.
Anyway,
Definitely.
that's a tangent, but and that's just something that popped in. But yeah, even more like you mentioned, some of even the contemporary writers that are popular is maybe not in the full-on pop culture sense, but pretty popular in maybe crossing over and getting into more of the being household names. So like Miranda July is maybe at the forefront of like people who aren't maybe necessarily English majors are reading her work. So I'm just
Hmm.
curious, maybe this is a little bit of a off the beaten path question, but as a writer and somebody who wants to have literary work and poetry and stories have a wider audience and a wider impact, Do you have thoughts on like where we are and how do we forge toward, a place where subcultures and these niche genres, like you mentioned earlier, can kind of get a little bit more of a grasp? Do you have any ideas, or are we
Mhm.
just stuck four readers at a time, here, one reader there?
Yeah,
Where you like,
it's a good question and one that I want to hear other people's answers to as well. And I think that it's always been with writing about the gatekeepers in a way, right? It's like because it's the agents and the publishing houses who are kind of deciding who gets published and who we all read. So, but obviously literary journals are an amazing place for people to publish and to get their work out into the world and small presses and indie presses. And it's that we definitely have more options now than, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I also think that actually social media has played a role in like poetry especially becoming a little more accessible. I'm not like a huge fan of like a lot of Insta poetry, but there are also like Poetry Foundation, like there's one like Poetry is Not a Luxury that create these posts of poems that are amazing and they get thousands and thousands of likes and who knows if all those people are actually writers themselves. But I think that the more and more that poetry gets shared and sometimes also with a visual component, I think can really help. And like someone like Miranda July has such a multifaceted career that you could also be into her as a filmmaker. Like she's done so many things that someone like that I think just like already has like a broader audience because they have like I mean she's on Portlandia like she has her hand in so many projects. But as far as like maybe poetry goes, I think like poetry that's more grounded and relatable and accessible can have like a wider reach or just like presented in a way that makes it more accessible. So even if the poem itself is like very abstract or referencing something that if you're an English major you would get, and if you're not, you wouldn't get. But as long as it's presented in a format that people have like actual access to it, I think it can go much farther.
good point. Yeah, I think there is this ability in social media to something could catch on in a way
Hmm.
where, yeah, is it like a scholarly study of Mary Oliver? Not quite, but people are seeing like a poem that,
Yeah.
coming up again and again and again. There is the communication could be taking place, like the poet is speaking to an audience through this method, which yeah, is definitely interesting. And I think there is something to like the kind of multimodal aspect, right? It's not just a
Hmm.
book in your hand. There are
Hmm.
kind of other elements to make it more visible, whether it's like literally, visual art or
Yeah.
filmmaking and other things like that. But I'm always curious about that tension of like a creative work versus, connecting with an audience. Yeah. And
Yeah.
like
I mean,
when
it's
it
so
hits, it hits.
hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's so many things competing for someone's attention, and a book takes time. It's not a song. You don't, you know what I mean? Like you don't
Yeah.
just sit there and listen to a song in 3 minutes. Like a book is like you dedicate time to a book. Hopefully you buy the book and you don't just stream it. You know what I mean? So it's difficult.
Correct. Yeah. A writer, artist, whoever, it doesn't necessarily have, a marketing department, and
No.
they don't have the, so that's part of what makes it a fascinating topic when it connects, because like it goes to show you like it can cut through like when those creative works cut through all that nonsense of the
Yeah.
marketing and like what is like prepackaged content. It's like, wow, this is really
Hmm.
cool. It can happen. It's possible.
Right. And it
Um,
also makes the experience more meaningful if your social media feed also contains poetry, and not just like people doing makeup or something. Like it's like, I don't know. I think that people actually do respond well to having the option to read something that doesn't feel like such a commitment and that gives them a taste of something that then they have a name and they can like explore that. Then they can like actually go to the bookstore and know who they're looking for.
yeah, that's
Hopefully.
that's a good idea. Yeah, I know. I was thinking, yeah, that's. It's my fantasy. I just go wander into the bookstore and like ask around.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
always, many people would share the experience, but yeah, that's always like such a cool avenue to finding new work and stuff like that.
Hmm.
That's kind of maybe a good connection to like as editor in chief of Cagibi. Can you share a little bit about how it is like
Hmm.
from the perspective of editor and maybe like sharing with our audience who is a lot of writers and artists and people who would be submitting their work,
Hmm.
what could they do to best showcase what they do as a creative person to the person on the other side like you.
Right, yeah. Well, so I've been editor in chief for all of 2023, 2024, and then moving into 2025. So the founding editors, Sylvie Bertrand and Christopher Shade, they founded it in 2017, and I came on board as a reader in 2018, like jumping in at the end of issue two. So I've been there really kind of since the beginning, and like moved up to fiction editor. And then they asked me if I wanted to be editor in chief so they could take a break. But they're also like hugely involved still. And so it really is a community, like you were saying, and like a communal process. I think, I don't make all of the decisions. I mean, I do essentially make final decisions about most things, but I'm judicious, and especially when it comes to the poetry and the translations, which are usually poetry, but sometimes prose. I do defer to like our poetry editor, Jean-Marie Osterman, and our translation editors, George Franklin and Jimena Gomez, because they obviously know more, even more than I do, especially in terms of the translations and also like poetic. Just, Jean-Marie is an incredible poetry editor. So if she really loves something and we have another couple of upvotes on it, we just publish it, whether or not I'm totally into the poem. So, and I think that's how it should be. I don't think that the founder or the editor-in-chief should have veto power if everybody else loves something, because it's all so subjective. And some things are just not my cup of tea, but they're fine. They're just not doing it for me. But so what happens on the back end, is that I assign pieces to readers who read in that genre. They vote on the pieces, they leave notes. If the piece gets a thumbs down, I always read their notes and often even skim the piece before declining. But I trust the readers, so they're really the ones who have like the first, for most of the pieces, they have like the first pass, and editors as well, like our genre editors as well. If it gets a thumbs up, then I usually assign it to another reader or editor to see what they think. So often, like several readers and editors end up voting on a specific piece. And we have like a whole thread going, like talking about it. Sometimes I even like send an email or get emails being like, hey, check this piece out because we don't want it to slip through our fingers and get accepted somewhere else. And we have like a system of labels. Like we have like a holy cow label, like, holy cow, this is
Mm.
amazing. We have encourage if decline, or like maybe like like it's not quite there. The other thing I think is different about our journal is that I will work with authors to edit their piece. So like I will accept something that needs a little bit of work. And I actually love doing that because I just love editing. So it's like I've accepted pieces where I'm not totally wowed by the ending, but the rest of the piece is amazing. So it's like, can we just fix the ending? Or a piece that has like extra stuff that we just like take out, like trim it down. We also don't have word count limitations for prose, and I stand by that because I write really long short stories. So we've published really lengthy pieces, and we also publish flash and poems of all lengths. I absolutely compromise. It's absolutely a team effort and collaborative, and we're all writers ourselves who are submitting pieces, so we understand. And sometimes, like, a rejection just comes down to like thematic similarities too, where it's just like we have too many pieces like this, or we've already published too many pieces like this. But I will hold a piece for a future issue. If I love it and it's not right for the forthcoming one, I'll still accept it and hold it. For some reason, we get a lot of pieces about animals. I don't know if that's consistent across journals, but so many stray animals or pets, or I don't know, just a lot of dogs, a lot of cats, a lot of motherhood, a lot of death, a lot of physical ailments, especially in memoir, as well as in poetry. I guess death is a big topic in poetry. So, but an issue can only have so many of the same types of poems or themes. Another thing is that We do read the cover letters, but I don't consider someone's writing credits unless it's relevant to the piece. And I actually love being the first journal to publish someone's work. We had an issue, the first issue I was editor-in-chief called Moses Poolside, the story. The writer's bio was just Dan Garner works as a bike messenger in Chicago. That was it. No, no writing credits, no writing background. Awesome story. Another story and another issue, theirs was just Michael Pereira is an American writer from Springfield, Massachusetts, killed in his first published story. So we also published Jean-Marie the fiction poetry editor accepted poems from a Greyhound bus driver who had never written or submitted a poem before, and she was so moved by like everything he was describing about like his blue collar job and like the just the details and the imagery and like the truism of like this bus barn and the people he worked with that was just so unlike anything else we've gotten. So I guess it's like it's just good for I think submitters to know that it's not just like, oh, Amy Dupcak doesn't like your poem. It is like a team effort. People are reading it. We do take it seriously. And then there's also other practical things, right? Is like obviously workshop your stuff before you send it to any journal. Obviously get people's feedback on it first, see what's working, what's not working. And something Jean-Marie also said is that, is this you talking and telling the reader what you think, or are you letting the poem like speak? Which is something too that like, to not feel like it has to be so explanatory. Or even in the cover letter, I feel like you have to explain yourself or explain the piece. Like the piece should speak for itself. Yeah, and then I have a lot of my own like personal pet
Mhm.
peeves.
Yeah, well, we'll
You
say
know?
I do want to hear those, but yeah, I think
Yeah.
as far as like a couple of those that are either unique or noteworthy, well, yeah, working with a writer to make some edits for publication, that it's not common, but I have done that as well. And I
Hmm.
think now that you like kind of mentioned it, it struck me as like, yeah, maybe that should happen a little bit more.
Yeah.
It takes some energy and effort and coordination and back and forth, which is obviously sometimes you're not always capable of doing that in a timeline. But yeah, that makes sense in this in this context of like making a couple of tweaks. Like you said, it could be a really strong poem in certain elements, but okay, look at this stanza, and we could
Yeah.
give another go of it, and it makes it a stronger piece. And then
Yeah.
we're happy as an editor, the writer's happy, and it can really just smooth over something that otherwise it will get declined, and who knows. So
Right.
yeah,
And I've also
yeah, it's unusual, but I like I said, I have done it, and it can happen.
hmm I was gonna say I've also never had a writer be like, no, I won't edit this piece. So
I guess that's true. Yeah, I haven't had that. I would second that. I tend to, if it's not going to fit in an issue size wise, or you get kind of quantity of pieces, or just thematically it would work better down the road. I'm not sure how many other places or people do that. I know I've run into it a couple of times myself, but yeah, that's a good thing to have in mind too, where it might be a little bit more of a delay or wait till publication, but I'm always happy to have something published later than not at all.
and
And I think like
exactly.
you said, yeah, it kind of helps both sides too. And then I love the first timers. Like, yeah, that's a shared experience too. Wild Roof Journal, you say, oh, this is my first published piece.
Hmm.
Um, that is a reasonably common thing, and that is encouraging, right? It's just like we said at the beginning that those kind of little pushes here and there can make a big difference. So yeah,
Yeah.
if it is somebody with a writing background and it's just their first accepted piece, somebody who's getting into writing from somewhere else, those are always, you know, it's always worth acknowledging. Like you don't have to have an MFA. You don't have to have,
Right. Right.
a degree, a list of publications. It's gonna, fit with somebody, and it's a matter of finding that somebody. But yeah, again, it's saying it is possible. It's it's uh
Yeah.
it's something that can definitely happen. And it's good to hear other publications who are open to that and have that kind of hands-on approach. I did want to ask, are there definitely do this in a submission, or
Mhm.
maybe even more importantly, like don't do the here, as a submitter?
Yeah. Well, okay. So start with some do nots. They're my pet peeves, of course.
Yeah, okay, yeah, yeah.
But this centering poems is a big no. Unless it's like a poem that's in a specific shape, right? Like definitely left justify everything. Um, and then also, so we actually don't have like a standardized font that we ask for, but I sort of feel like I do that on purpose. It actually ends up weeding out things a little bit. Um, in the sense of like, yeah, if someone's using like Comic Sans or something, you're like, well, I don't know if this is going to be a serious contender. But I would say, yeah, like any like large typewriter font or something, it's a big no. Big headings really bug me. Or like when someone has their name on every page, or like by this person after every poem, it's just like, I don't know. Again, let the poem speak for themselves. I would prefer no heading. You don't have to put your name on it. That's in the cover letter. We know you wrote it, that kind of thing. Um, I think also a big pet peeve in terms of content wise is writing a poem or a story as a vehicle for some point that you want to make. That's really obvious usually and just feels kind of insincere. So I don't personally love that. Also, like writing about your own sort of glory days with no reflection. I feel like I've seen that a lot, and it might just be because now that it's I don't know if it's always been a thing or now that everyone's using submittable and it's so much easier to submit, but I do feel like we get a lot of submissions from people who may or may not be writers who are retired, and I think it's great. It's a wonderful thing to do with your time as a retiree, but I have encountered pieces where there's just no it's just like these things that I used to do when I was young. And it's like with no self-awareness of like, well, maybe that wasn't actually a great thing. Or like, how do you feel about that now? So you definitely need reflection, definitely need that sense of like, why is this story being told? Why is this poem being written? What's the like urgency? What's the truth they're trying to share? What's like the emotional heart or the payoff or like the guts of it? Things to do that I like is when your cover letter is addressed to specific editors. That's kind of nice because it just means that you at least went to that about page. Or if you reference something specific you like about the journal. Obviously, anyone who reads the journal before they submit and like sends us something that they know is up our alley, that's like a big green flag. Because, we don't publish genre fiction and we do get genre fiction. And it's like, well, I feel like maybe you didn't really read some of the pieces we've published. So whether or not we accept it, if it's a good fit, that's a good sign. Yeah, things that have subtlety, have subtext, have nuance, things that take risks and are bold, but are not, overly cautious. Although I will say that like writers should tread carefully if they're portraying someone of like a different ethnicity or different, gender. But I do like boldness and, yeah, provocative statements, word choice, interesting word choice, something that happens, something that feels urgent. I also really do like darkness and surreal and macabre kind of stuff, but not when it's overdone. And I'm also just for me personally, like with poetry, I'm like a free verse poet. Like I do like rhyme, but I'm not so into archaic forms. So free verse poetry is like with natural, not forced rhymes and rhythm and flow and playing with language, but without being pretentious, without throwing in all the cool words that without overdoing it. Those are the poems that tend to speak to me more, like the authentic voice versus the poetry voice. Um, so yeah, those are some
Yeah.
of the things. I'm also like not a fan of words spaced out all over the page. Like I sort of want intentional and consistent formatting and for it to look neat and not like messy. That might just be me. It's also harder to produce a poem with words like all over the page. So it ends up having to be like a PDF that's like, on the page and just looks different. So that's not like if it doesn't have to look that way, maybe try another format. But ultimately, like as long as the poem is speaking some truth and it's not merely observant or not merely narrative, but a poem that really speaks of some deep experience or thought, and it not being precious, not being quaint, nothing schmaltzy. Those are my big things.
Yeah. No, those are great. Yeah, and it I mean, like you said, it is a subjective thing. So yeah, there are some, even if it is like a personal preference, like yeah, I I tend to agree on like a center justified. There have been pieces that have been published that are center justified, so it's not
Hmm.
a
Well, center
guaranteed
center
decline.
justified
But
that's better. That's better. It's justified. That's okay.
yeah.
It's the centered where it's like forming this, it's just
Oh, I
I
see
think
what you
for
mean.
yeah, I
The
think
shaped poem. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
I
yeah,
think for
same. Yeah,
me
same here.
it feels like what I did in high school. I think that's why I don't love it. Like it's like I don't know. It just
Yeah.
looks very amateur to me.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So yeah, there are sometimes a little thing like that. I love it. I love a typewriter, but a typewriter font in
Yeah.
a Microsoft Word document, it just yeah, there is like a little bit of an aesthetic kind of like um
Right. Like no one really wants to read a whole story in Courier New. Like that, like if it's a screenplay, sure. But like
yeah,
really just keep it simple. Just Times New Roman or, another like Helvetica font or sans serif font. Like just keeping it simple. And like no giant text heading, no, just
yeah,
give us your very stripped down minimalist text because it's not about that, right? It's about what you're saying, not exactly like you don't have to make a show of it.
let the work speak for for itself.
Exactly.
Those are
Yeah.
always good, solid pieces of advice. It is just an interesting question because you can do it well. Yeah. So if it is
Hmm.
you know, an animal poem that's done well,
Oh
like
yeah. Oh no,
it's
definitely.
like
No,
there's tons of them, but
I've
I see what
loved,
you mean. There are
yeah,
it's like just common subject matter, common themes, common images. Like you're not gonna really get around some of that. It doesn't mean they're off limits. Just like
exactly.
there's a craft to it.
Hmm.
Um, and then
Yeah.
maybe yeah, if you do as one like final offshoot. Sometimes I like to ask, is there a writing prompt that you like? I mean, you definitely have teaching experience and stuff like that. So
Hmm.
even from the teaching perspective, is there a type of prompt or writing exercise that you enjoy giving a student, even if it's one maybe that you don't use as a writer?
Yeah, well, so I'm a really big fan of making lists. I actually also host this little prompt party with a few of my female friends, and we just did one on last Friday. So yeah, a week ago, where I'm basically being like teachery with them, and I just like come up with these prompts, or sort of borrow prompts from, things I've done with students, and we all write in notebooks. And I really enjoy prompts that have a collaborative element, but then you write individually because I don't like writing with someone else. I like writing my own things, but I like having like a basis together for what we're writing. So prompts where we all like create a list together, for example, or we're all creating our own lists and we're sharing them, and then you choose something on the list. So something I do actually is I'm a big collector. Like I have so many notes and they're all over the place in my notes app. Like no one else would understand because like my organization only makes sense to me. But like I save lines, ideas, even I have a list of words that I love that I've come across in other, stories, books. And some of them I've had to look up and I add them to this list and it's like, okay, like I have a goal of like using all of these words in something, or these lines that I don't know what to do with. I also have a list of things I want to write poems about that are not poems yet. And also, one of my favorite prompts that I've been doing actually was introduced to me, I believe, at the Sarah Lawrence writing program in high school. And then it was reintroduced in various other workshops. And then I've been doing it with workshops, is writing I Remembers. Do you know that prompt and Joe Brainerd, his book, I Remember? No.
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, Joe Brainerd is like a writer who he created the style, which is like in a way a sort of a writing hack because it like accesses, like it jogs your memory and you can access these like sort of sensory snapshots from different parts of your life. And you can either leave them as those small little bits, or you can use them, like mine them as raw material for longer pieces or more intentional poems. But basically, we just usually read a few of his just to sort of get the gist of it. And then you end up just writing individual sentences that don't connect. I mean, it can be more than a sentence, but usually, like most of them are just one sentence. And every line has to start with I remember. So sometimes I'll give prompts like, okay, like party, grandparent, breakfast, cold weather. And it just jogs your memory. Like, I remember, the French toast my grandmother used to cut into squares for me, or something like that. And then from there, you bounce to the next one, you bounce to the next one. And sometimes there's like a stream of consciousness happening where you're sort of like one leads to the next and they're connected. But the goal is really to just have all of these random memories that you don't know what to do with, or they don't seem like stories in and of themselves, like come out onto the page. And then you can shape and restructure them as you want. And then choosing one or two to use as an actual like fodder for an actual poem. Because like I said, I'm a big fan of like sort of the small moments that make their way into fiction or poetry. And so these like micro little moments it can spark an entire poem or entire piece. Or you can just include it in something else that you've written for more like texture and sensory experience. Yeah. Also, it's fun. And
Yeah.
you can set a timer, or you can say like, okay, I'm gonna do 20 of them, just like little bits. It's like having a snack.
Yes, that is a good one. Yeah. So I might use one of those exercises. We'll see. Um, but yeah, there's always that is the always the kind of the purpose behind it is like see what happens. It might just be a little nugget you put in somewhere else. Doesn't need to be its own, standalone piece that you're just coming up with in this kind of generative exercise. So yeah, if you get even if it is a word or phrase, go for it. It's always a victory. Um,
Yeah. And you can
yeah,
recontextualize it. Like it doesn't have to be, you don't have to limit yourself to like your own experience. Like you can take that and use it for like fiction, like you can give it to a character. You can create a whole new experience around it. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, I feel like. So I think we we did our job as far as, sharing a little bit about the publication, of course, and some of the details about submitting, but yeah, learning about you as a writer and some other stuff. So I think we'll dismount, but thanks again for joining in and for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me.